Hello everyone, welcome back. We were discussing about the respiratory system in humans, where we have already discussed about what is respiration, the two types of respiration, aerobic and anaerobic respiration, the differences between aerobic and anaerobic respiration. Today, we will study about the different organs that are involved in respiration. Or we call it the respiratory tract. So today we will discuss about the respiratory tract in humans. Now we all know that we breathe in air through the nose. But which part of our nose? So our nose has two nostrils, so air enters through the nostrils. From the nostrils, it enters the nasal chamber. So we breathe in air, the air enters through the nostrils. It enters the nasal chamber, and from the nasal chamber, it reaches the pharynx. I will be explaining each part or each organ later on. So, first the nostrils, then the air passes through the nasal chamber. From the nasal chamber, it reaches the pharynx. From the pharynx, it enters the larynx. So, nostrils, nasal chamber, pharynx and the larynx. From the larynx, it enters the windpipe, which is technically called or biologically called the trachea. Okay. So I just draw. So air enters through the nostrils, then it passes to the nasal chamber, then from the nasal chamber it reaches the pharynx. Now the pharynx, it is a common opening for the food pipe or the esophagus and the windpipe or the trachea. So trachea is the windpipe. Okay, so pharynx, this pharynx is a common opening for the esophagus or the food pipe and the trachea or the windpipe. From there, the air enters the larynx. Now what is the larynx? Now I'm speaking. How do I speak? It is because of the larynx. The larynx is commonly called the voice box. So larynx is the voice box. Okay. Now, if you feel, especially in boys, you see that pointed structure out here, the Adam's apple. That is actually the larynx, which moves up and down. It is prominent in boys. We can easily see in girls. If you keep your hand here, you will feel that something is moving up and down. That is actually a larynx or a voice box. Now, the larynx has membranous structures which are folded inside it. Okay, so when air passes through it, it creates a vibration. So they vibrate. The folds inside the larynx vibrate, and due to which sound is produced. Then from here, the air enters the trachea or the windpipe. Now, this opening of the trachea has a lid-like structure. So it has every can bottle has a lid, isn't it? Similarly, the trachea also has a cover or a lid which is made out of a membrane-like structure, and we call it epiglottis. Now what does this epiglottis do? Now when we are eating food, what happens? We swallow it. So from here, in that case, the food from the mouth, it goes here enters the pharynx. Okay. Now from the pharynx, it has to enter the food pipe and not the windpipe. So when we swallow anything, the epiglottis closes. So this will close the windpipe. So the only way for the food to enter is the food pipe. Hence, food cannot enter the trachea. Sometimes what happens is when we speak and when we talk and eat, what happens is the epiglottis does not close properly. So sometimes food may enter the trachea, that is when we get choked. Okay, so that is the reason why we should never talk while eating. So this epiglottis is a lid-like structure which closes the trachea or the windpipe when we swallow food. Okay, now the air has entered the trachea or the windpipe. Now what happens is, just before entering the lungs, the trachea is divided into two bronchi. It is divided into two bronchi. Singular is bronchus. So air from the trachea enters the bronchus or the bronchi. Now it enters the lungs. Okay. Now this bronchus, once it enters the lungs, divides into or branches into many bronchioles. Okay, so the bronchus branches into many bronchioles inside the lungs. Now the bronchioles, the first branches are called primary, then secondary, then we have the tertiary. So they keep on branching and finally they end in small bag-like structures. These bag-like structures are called air sacs or the alveolus. This is singular, plural is alveoli. So alveolus. Okay, so this is how the air enters the lungs. So we breathe in air through the nostrils, it passes into the nasal chamber, from there it passes into the pharynx. The pharynx is a common opening for the food pipe and the windpipe or the trachea. Then from the pharynx it enters into the larynx, which is commonly called the voice box. And the larynx has some folds inside it, or the membranes are folded inside the larynx, and as air passes through it, it vibrates those membranes, creating sound. From there, the air enters the trachea or the windpipe. Now the trachea, at the opening of the trachea, there is a small lid called the epiglottis, which closes the trachea when we swallow anything. Then from here, the air enters. Now just before the trachea enters the lungs, the trachea branches into two bronchi or singular bronchus. Inside the lungs, the bronchus divides into many bronchioles. The bronchioles finally end in small bag-like structures called air sacs or alveolus. This is how the air enters the lungs. Okay, now this nasal chamber. I told you from the nostrils, the air passes into the nasal chamber. Now try blowing out air from your nose on your palm. You will feel that it is warm. The air that we are breathing out is warm because what happens is as the air passes through the nasal chamber, it warms the air. In the nasal chamber, the air that we breathe in is slowly brought to normal body temperature. So the air that we breathe in is warmed as it passes through the nasal chamber. The nasal chamber is also lined with hair, fine, small hairs, and mucus. Mucus is a slimy thing, okay? So it is also a jelly-like slimy thing called mucus. So our nasal chamber is lined with fine hairs and mucus. Now what does this hair and mucus do? Now when we breathe in air, lot of germs, lot of dust may also enter along with it. So as the air passes through the nasal chamber, this mucus and hair help in trapping the germs and dust particles, so that finally when the air enters the lungs, only clean air enters the lungs. Understood till here? So the passage of the respiratory tract in humans, we breathe through our nostrils, passes through the nasal chamber. When air passes through the nasal chamber, it warms the air, and the nasal chamber is lined with fine hair and mucus, which traps all the germs and dust particles. Then from here it reaches the pharynx, which is the common opening for both the food pipe and the windpipe. Then from here it enters the larynx, which is the voice box. From there it enters the trachea. The opening of the trachea has a lid-like structure known as epiglottis. From there it enters the bronchus. Now what's the bronchus? Now just before entering the lungs, the trachea divides into two branches known as bronchus. Inside the lungs, the bronchus divides into many bronchioles, and finally the bronchioles end in sac-like structures known as the alveolus. Okay, now the lungs, structure of the lungs. Now, our lungs is a double-walled structure. That means it has two walls around it. Okay, and these walls are known as the pleural membrane. So the lungs is surrounded by a double-walled membrane called the pleural membrane. And now there's a gap in between the membrane. No? This gap is filled by a jelly. Everyone has eaten jelly, I'm sure. So it is filled by a jelly-like substance known as the pleural fluid. So the gap between the membrane is filled by a jelly-like fluid known as pleural fluid. Now, while playing football, while running, when you push each other, you may hurt your lungs. But this pleural fluid protects our lungs from injury. So that is the reason why every time you fall, every time someone pushes you, your lung is not injured, because the pleural fluid, it protects the lungs from injuries. Okay, so I hope you all understood what we did today. Thank you. Bye. Keep watching my videos.